We're going to actually start the session. We have a lot to cover with you folks and want to be mindful of your time. My name is Deb DiFilippo. I'm the Sandata Customer Success Manager. I am supporting Missouri Department of Social Services on the home health care services implementation. We'll have a few speakers joining us today, including myself. We have Terry Woodward from the Missouri DSS side. She is the Strategic Initiatives Manager, Project Manager. We also have Lucas Knipp, who's the Project Manager. On the Sandata side, we also have Clella Newcomb. She's the Director of Implementation Services. So welcome again. I will take us through the town hall guidelines. We will then turn it over to Terry, who will speak specifically on the federal and state electronic visit verification EVV requirements. She'll also speak to the providers on the provider process. We'll then pivot over to Clella, who will take us through the integration testing process, the EVV vendor specification in JSON, common EVV vendor support issues, errors, and troubleshooting steps, support contact information, required information that we need to help further triage those issues. Lucas will then speak to the EVV vendor and provider support resources and also speak to the upcoming town hall sessions we have scheduled. The purpose of today's town hall, this is town hall number 1. Provider online registration is now officially published, as well as the updated vendor specification for home healthcare services. They are now posted on the Missouri DSS EVV website. We will share that link with you in this presentation. You folks are all on mute. However, we do welcome Q&A feature. You'll see that on your screen. Any question that we can't address throughout the session, we will look to review those internally and bring you back those responses through other communications. At the end of this survey, there'll also be at the end of this session, there'll be a survey. We do encourage your participation on that as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Terry. She's going to speak to the federal and state EVV requirements. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Deb.
You're welcome.
Thanks. I'm Terry Woodward, and I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager from OHealthNet Division, and I have been leading the EVV implementation project since it started in 2018. So EVV has been around for a minute, but I always kind of like to just start out anytime we talk with providers or with vendors with a little EVV 101, just to kind of remind everybody of why we're having this conversation. So the 21st Century CARES Act is really what sparked us. That's federal legislation. It was passed in 2016, and a very small piece of that legislation required states to use an electronic visit verification system for any of their Medicaid-funded personal care services or home health care services. So basically, all that means is that, look, guys, we're going to stop using paper timesheets. We're going to stop having people sign pieces of paper and shuffling it around, and we're going to collect all of that information electronically. So the CARES Act was very specific in the things that the EVV systems have to capture, but it wasn't very specific in how that has to occur. So based on the federal law, we know that every EVV system that we're using has to collect information about who's getting the service, who is the caregiver that is providing the service, what is that service that's being delivered, where is it happening? And since we're kind of focusing on home health care services today, we know that that location is going to be in the home of the participant, the date and time the service starts, and the date and time the service ends. So those are very specific things that we can't wiggle around on. We absolutely have to have that information. As a state, Missouri decided we really don't want to ask for any more than what we have to. So our state guidelines are going to very closely follow those federal guidelines. So what we said is, okay, we know that we have to identify who's getting that service. So the most reasonable thing for us to use was the DCN, the departmental client number. So that's that 8-digit number that we always use to identify our clients. But just as a secondary verification, we also are requiring that date of birth information be entered on any of our visit data that's sent in as well. We want to compare that date of birth to the DCN just to make sure that when we send that information, we are indeed talking about the individual that we think we're talking about. We also have to identify who is that caregiver who's providing the service. Well, since we require all of our caregivers to go through that family care safety registry, for us, it made sense to use that number that they're assigned to identify their caregiver. And that's really helpful because we know that we have individuals who work for multiple companies or individuals who might have multiple last names, just lots of different ways that we might not be able to tell that we're talking about the same person. But by using this single unique identifier, we're able to tell that we're always talking about who we think we're talking about. So those were how we decided to identify those folks. I'm sorry, I feel like I have a little frog in my throat or something. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the services that require EVV. But before we do that, just in case there are maybe some new providers on this call who haven't been part of the EVV conversation before, when the CARES Act went into effect, we as a state were already utilizing electronic visit verification for some of our personal care services. We had required that through state regulation for certain types of services. So as a result, we had like 60 different EVV vendors that were already providing services here in Missouri. So I said earlier that at a federal level, they didn't say this is how you have to do it. They just said this is what you have to do. We decided that the best option, the best way to achieve those federal requirements was to just let all of our providers, our personal care service and our home health care service providers, pick whatever sort of EVV system best meets their needs. Because, you know, a big company might have a different EVV need than a smaller company that just has a handful of clients. So we opted to just let all of our providers go ahead and use whoever they want. We had providers who had already invested a lot of time and money into EVV systems, and we didn't want to disrupt their flow. So as a state, we decided that we would use an aggregator solution to take information from all of those different EVV systems and dump it all together. So when I talk about it, I always kind of like to refer to it as a funnel. So we have all these different EVV systems, and we have 42 right now that are actively exchanging information. So they all dump into this big funnel and they spew out at the end in a way that all looks alike. So that's where SanData comes into the conversation, because we worked with SanData and they are the ones that are providing that aggregator solution for us. We call it the EVV aggregator solution. We use the acronym EAS a lot. So as we're talking through this, if you hear us say EAS or EAS, that's what we're talking about. It's that aggregator solution. So back to where we were with EVV before I digressed just a little bit there. The federal government also identified which services specifically have to report their visit data electronically. So what you're seeing on your screen right now are those services that the feds say, if you are providing this, you need to use EVV. So it's pretty much all of our home health services. It's your nursing, OT, PT, personal care aides, speech therapy. If you're delivering home health through a managed care organization, you still have that requirement to report back electronically. So all of those things are required. There is a little note on the bottom of your screen that talks about the memo field. There is a field that we collect information on, and it's not a required field for home health. Your EVV systems should have the option to enter just some free field text. We really do recommend that you utilize that memo field when you're out there working. If there's anything unique or special about an in-home visit that you think needs to be noted. So we do really recommend use of that memo field. And you'll see that a little bit later whenever SanData actually starts showing you some of the data requirements. All right, our next slide, please.
questions coming in,
Sure.
so thank you. I think there was somebody who may have raised a hand. I just want to reiterate in this forum today, the way that we're going to see your questions and be able to address them is through that Q&A. So just wanted to reiterate that. And now, Terry, I'll advance you here.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the provider process. The whole process of getting your data into the aggregator and getting it back for the state to see it is a huge collaboration between you as a home health care service provider and your EVV vendor. So we expect lots of back and forth, lots of looking at stuff and working through things. We want you guys to work together. I mean, the state is part of that team, Sandata is part of the team, but really that intimate day-to-day relationship is going to be between the provider and the vendor. So want to make sure that providers are clear about what their expectations are, and then we'll let Sandata talk about what the vendor expectations are. But the very first thing, okay, so not really the first thing to do as a provider is to select your EVV vendor and make sure you have one. So assuming that that has already occurred, that you already know who is going to be providing this service for you, the very first thing you need to do is to register that vendor. That registration process just opened today. There's a link on our website. When you log in, you're going to need to provide your 9-digit Medicaid provider ID. If you're a home health care service provider, that is going to start with the 58. We do have some providers that have more than one Medicaid ID. Just a note that if you have more than one, you do need to complete that form for every single one of them. Also, when you submit the form, they're going to want your MPI. And then they're going to need to collect information about who that EVV vendor is and who to contact within that vendor organization. So when you fill out that form, those are the pieces you need. If you do use more than one EVV system to meet your business needs, you also will need to complete that form for each EVV vendor that you are contracting with. Once you get that form submitted, you're going to get an email that says, hey, you're registered, and then we'll kind of work you through the next steps. If you don't know what your provider ID is, at the bottom of the screen here, there is an email address, and that's our Medicaid Audit and Compliance Unit. They're actually the ones that assign those numbers. You can email them if you're not sure what your number is, but you will need to include your MPI when you reach out to them so that they can be sure that they're providing you with the correct information. All right. So you're registered now, right? And you've gotten your confirmation email. The next thing that's going to happen is EASE training. And remember, I said EASE is that aggregator system that we're talking about that Sandata hosts for us. So I want everyone to understand, and I'm saying this because we had a bit of a lack of enthusiasm with a lot of our personal care service providers. They didn't really want to complete the training. They didn't see the value. What I want to tell you is that this aggregator system is valuable to you as a provider agency, because once we have all of our interfaces complete and your data is there, you can log in and you can see your information the same way that the state can. So it's a great resource. It's a really good tool. So please think of this training not as a, oh my gosh, I have to take this training, but as a, I want to get in there and look and learn how to navigate the system. So that being said, at least one person from your agency has to take the training. If nobody from your agency takes the training, you're kind of dead in the water, because we won't be issuing any login information for the aggregator. But as many people as you want can take it. So one person can take it, 10 people can take it, one person can take it 5 times. It's free. You kind of take it at your own pace. It's online. I really recommend that you take that training and have people that are comfortable and that understand how to use the system, because at the end of the process, you're going to hear that it's your responsibility to make sure your data is there. So if you don't take the training and you don't know how to get to the data, you will never be able to finish the process. I always recommend anytime anybody takes the training, complete that, print out your certificate, keep it for your records, just in case someday we say, hey, did you ever take the training? You can pull out your certificate and say, yes, I did. Here it is. So just keep that for your records. And then there's a link here in the presentation, and we will share the presentation with you. It will be posted on our website, so you can go out there and click on the link. We also have a lot of this information just on our website in general. So there'll be a couple ways to get to this supplemental training link within our website. Okay, so now you've registered. Somebody from your agency's taken the training. It's time to really rock and roll now, right? So while you were taking the training and everything, your EVV vendor has been working to pass integration testing. We have to be able to know that the vendor that you selected is able to send your visit data to the aggregator in the correct format so that it can be fed back to the state and to you as a provider for evaluation, right? So as soon as your vendor is able to show that they've done that, and we have a lot of vendors, like I said, we have, I think, 42 who have already proven that they can do this. So the vendor has passed their testing, you have taken your training, it's time to get your login information. So the provider is going to get the information, the vendor is going to get the information, and at that point, that's when that EVV vendor is going to start submitting all their visit data for you to the EASE system. During this whole testing process, I really, really want all of my home healthcare service providers to please keep in touch with your EVV vendors, because there's a lot going on during this time. There's lots of back and forth. There's lots of files. There's lots of technical stuff. And it's really easy to lose sight of where you are, or to just sit back and think, oh, my vendor's taking care of it, or the vendor's thinking, oh, the provider's taking care of it. But in reality, nobody's taking care of it. So please talk to each other, talk to each other. So that was our step 3. Step 4 is what I mentioned a bit earlier. The very last thing that you need to do is to log into that aggregator system and look and make sure that your EVV vendor is sending your data and that it looks right to you. You want to make sure, yes, these really are my clients. Yes, these are really my caregivers. This is really when we were there. Everything is working. If you're not able to log in and see that information, then the state can't see it either. So if I reach out to you and say, hey, provider, there's nothing from you in the aggregator, and you say, yes, there is, my vendor is sending it, the first thing I'm going to say is send me a screenshot and show me it's there. And 9 times out of 10, providers just aren't logging in and making sure that data is there. So I really encourage you, take a look in there, use it, get familiar with it, and use it as a tool to benefit you. And we do require that the system, the EVV system, send all of the visit data to the aggregator at least once a day. So providers, you need to be getting your data into the EVV system, and the EVV system needs to be sending it over. That means sometimes it might not be complete. It might not have everything. That's okay. But we want it to be as near to real time as possible, because that's part of the beauty of having an electronic system as opposed to paper, right? You can get your hands on it a lot faster. So we want that transmission to occur at least once a day. And again, I say again, please make sure that as providers, you're communicating frequently with your vendors to make sure that there aren't any hiccups and that things are flowing back and forth. If you ever log in as a provider and you're not seeing what you expect, the first thing you need to do is reach out to your EVV vendor and say, hey, what's going on? Things don't look right. So I do believe that might be the last one of my slides, maybe. Yes.
You are correct. Thank you. Well done. Chloe, I'm going to pass it over to you to speak more directly to the vendors now in the integration testing process.
Thank you so much, Deb. Great job, Terry. That was a great overview of the expectations from our Missouri team. And now we're going to walk through how it is that vendors can integrate with the SAN data system, make sure that their data comes through and that they are in compliance with Missouri's expectations. So for our integration details, there's a few things that we want to just kind of walk through. We do use a state supplied feed for our members. And so as part of your integration and your testing, you will be supplied a 6-member record that has the client DCN and date of birth listed for your test account. That data will be supplied with the vendors when credentials are sent for our UAT test environment. In production, that match is done both on the client DCN and date of birth, and we'll cover that in more detail. So we do want to make sure that that is a flow that you are very comfortable with in our UAT testing environment as you are going through the certification process. No DCN match will result in a client record being rejected. No date of birth match will result in a client record being rejected. A successful DCN match and date of birth will result in the record then being attempted to be added to the provider account. We'll talk through a little bit more about what that flow looks like, but at a high level, you do need to make sure that DCN and date of birth match the expected formats that we have for Missouri. To align with the production requirements during testing, EVV vendors will submit those daily member files with updates. That way you get in the habit of knowing exactly what that's going to look like. And this is really integral. We do see that client not found is certainly a sore subject where it can be very difficult to make sure you have the right information. We want to make sure you're very practiced in that. Next slide, please. Our certification testing checklist, one EVV vendor will need to certify for all of the providers that are using that EVV vendor. So if you have a vendor and they have multiple providers, they may be in process for that certification, again, for all of those providers at the same time. Once they are certified, they do not have to go through a recertification as they have with new providers. We are not requiring a recertification for any existing vendors that may be already providing EVV data on behalf of our personal care services. Once your testing is complete, you've got your checklist, you've filled everything out, you've gone through the different testing scenarios, submit that completed checklist to SANData at the moaltevv@sandata.com. SANData will validate that testing checklist. If the vendor passes, then they will issue those production credentials for all of the provider agencies, and they'll be added to that certified list of the Missouri DSS vendors. If they do fail their testing checklist validation, SANData will go ahead and give the feedback on what needs to be corrected, and then the checklist can be resubmitted. If that does happen multiple times, that's not a problem. Again, we're here to help. We have a tier 3 team that does help with that moaltevv@sandata.com email, and all of your questions are welcome so that we can get that certification as quickly as possible. The certification credentials are distributed to the vendor and to the provider so that they have that information. And then the providers will be accessing our ease in order to verify that they have the correct information that's available. The EVV vendors will be sending all of the data using those production credentials, but will not have direct access to ease. So some of the common questions, we do have production and UAT endpoints. So the UAT-API.sandata.com will be the URL for our endpoint during the testing and completion of the checklist. Once we transition to live, you will be using the API.sandata.com with no UAT in front of it. In the bill visit field of visit record, we do have a validation for that, and you'll notice that our specification, when we take a look at it, does say that it is looking for a string that says true. So bill visit is kind of a poorly named element, but when we send that, we're basically saying that that visit should be part of the reporting and available for the state to do investigations with. If we mark it to false, then we will be showing it as deleted or omitted. Again, bill visit is a poorly named element. It does not mean that we will be billing for that visit through SANData. It just means whether it should be included in our reporting and an active visit for the agency account. And then when will SANData accept testing data? We are going to start testing on March 6th, 2023. So you do have a little bit of time to do some integration prior to that testing opening. And this town hall is here to kind of walk you through anything you might need to help you get to that goal. Our next town hall will then follow up with kind of at that testing point. And again, you may have more questions now that you've done some of that integration. Let's go ahead and take a look at our EVV vendor specification in JSON. Next slide, please. So as we're looking at this, we do have our specification and our user guide housed on the Missouri EVV website. We've got a couple of links listed here. That specification user guide does walk you through how to read the specifications, some of our date formats, some additional information on the elements and ways that you would go ahead and be able to interpret conditional segments and child segments, REST API basics as well, a little bit about some of our REST API usage. The EVV vendor specification does contain 3 sections: client, employee, and visit. They are 3 separate transmissions, and we're going to quickly walk through those so that we can go ahead and make sure you're comfortable with those. For our client data segments, we're going to have 3 segments that are required in that client record. The parent segment is the client general, that is required. We have a child segment for the client address. It is required to have at least 1 client address associated with the record. Client phone is a 3rd recommended child segment for this particular data transmission. It's recommended, but client pair segments, which may be in use in other programs, are not required and should not be sent. What are the identifiers that we use for our matching logic? We do use the provider ID value. It's a 9-digit Medicaid ID for Missouri, and we'll be using that to make sure that we have the correct data going into the correct agency account. That client birth date, again, we're going to have a 4-digit year dash 2-digit month dash 2-digit day, and that will need to match what is in our file that is coming from the state. Our client identifier is the 8-digit DCN. This will include any leading zeros to make that exactly 8 digits. The error message that you will get if that is unable to match to that state feed would be client ID not found. That is true for both client identifier as well as client birth date. If you do get this error and you're confident that that birth date and identifier is correct, you can resubmit after 24 hours to see if you can obtain that client identifier match. Client identifier and client date of birth must match to the state's MMIS data. And the client address segment is required and client phone segment is recommended. Please note that we will be using that client Medicaid ID to determine if we have a new or update to a record. So make sure that you're using that DCN consistently. Here's a look at our specifications on the left and a JSON on the right. On the left, we have our client general segment showing our provider qualifier, provider ID, client qualifier, client ID. So as we look at that, the element that we are expecting is in the left-hand side. In that column, it must be in exactly that case with no spaces as the actual element name. The description gives you an idea of what kind of value you will be providing. The expected value, if it is in quotations, is exactly that string. So we would expect that the provider qualifier is going to be exactly Medicaid ID as you see there, same case. Provider ID, you can see that we don't have that actual quotations around it. So we're looking for that Medicaid ID, exactly 9 digits, including leading zeros. Again, if we translate that to what we see over in the JSON on the right, you can see that for provider qualifier, we used Medicaid ID. And for our provider ID, we actually provided 9 digits. So as you look through here, a couple things to note. That final column is our validation rule. That does tell you any special information that you might need to know, like the max length of characters, what kinds of characters are supported. If you look down at client middle initial, most of the way down that screen, there's a note there that says can be null. When we have something that can be null, it can be sent through with a value, that's perfectly acceptable, with empty string, so in other words, just 2 sets of quotations. It can be sent through as the keyword null, or it can be missing completely from the JSON transmission. All of these are acceptable. That is what would be considered an optional field, does not require to be submitted. Again, you can see here in the format, we've got our parent segment, which is our client general, and then we have that child segment for the client address and client phone demonstrated. Let's go ahead and move on. For employee overview, we do have one required segment for our employees, and the employee in this case is the person who is providing service in the home. We are talking about that caregiver, care worker, or the employee of the provider agency. The segment that we do require is called the employee general. The identifiers that are used for our matching logic, again, our provider ID value, which is that 9-digit Medicaid ID. We want to make sure we have everything going to the correct agency account. Our employee identifier, that's an 8 digits exactly, including any leading zeros, of the Family Care Safety Registry number. The employee validation will use that employee identifier to determine whether or not it is the correct length. In other words, if it's not 8 digits or if it's longer than 8 digits, it will be rejected. And to make sure that we either match or update a new, update an existing record or insert a new record if that employee identifier does not match to the records that are already existing in that agency account. Next slide. So once again, we have our spec down below. We have our JSON up above, a little bigger this time, which I think is helpful. Same columns. We have our elements on the left. We have our description as the second column. The third column is kind of that expected value. Again, we use the same convention where you'll see quotations around something that is an exact string. And then we've got our validation rule on the right-hand side. And as you can see, employee other ID does allow for a vendor employee identifier or a provider vendor or provider employee identifier, but it can be null. You can send that through or not send that through as you choose. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Visit overview. This does have one required segment. It's called Visit General for our visit records. There are 3 what we call conditional segments for our visit records as well. By conditional, they're not exactly optional. They can become required depending on what information you might be sending through. Those segments are our called segments, our visit changes segment, our visit tasks segment. The identifiers that are used for matching logic in our visit general is going to be our provider ID, again, the 9-digit Medicaid ID for Missouri, our visit other ID, which is the ID from the EVV vendor system. So at this point, we are asking that you identify each of those visits uniquely and use that visit other ID to go ahead and communicate any updates or changes consistently for that individual visit. The client identifier, it's the 8-digit departmental client number, and our employee identifier, 8-digit Family Care Safety Registry number. Again, those are going to need to be exactly 8 digits, so you will need to include any leading zeros, just as you did for the employee record or the client record when you submitted those. We also have our procedure code validation. So for our visits, we must use a valid Missouri payer program and procedure code in that visit record in order for us to accept that. Again, it helps to prevent us from having information that's not correct for the Missouri program by making sure that it is a service that is part of our home health expansion. We'll be looking at what that looks like, but do make sure that you're referring to the specification. So very nice appendix there that goes through each of those payer, program, service combinations, including modifiers. Client identifier must match to an existing client record. I've said it a couple of times and I will say it a couple of more. We do need to make sure that we have our client record and it was successfully added before we are going to be able to accept that visit. And again, if for some reason you got a client ID not found when you were submitting your client record, wait 24 hours and go ahead and try to obtain that client identifier match. Your employee identifier, again, must match to an existing employee record. Optional segments, again, as we spoke about, become required based on what the condition might be for that segment. If you have sent a visit and you have sent it with the call data and you find out that there's something that needs to change, you need to add a task, you need to perhaps change the client, you need to change the employee, you need to do something that changes that visit. Now that visit change segment changes from optional to required on that resubmission. It's also required if you send through a manual call type for the type of call that you've collected. That is also true if you adjust dates and times on a call. So even if it's your first submission and you're submitting that with a manual call type or adjusted times, you will be required to send that visit change segment. Visits performed without electronic call data do require that visit changes and should be sent through as a call type of manual. So again, our calls child segment will allow you a call type of manual, and we would like to have that information submitted in that way. Adjusted in and out times should be reserved for adjusting the information that was submitted in the calls segment only. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Again, we've got our specification on the left, we've got our JSON on the right. In the same columns, again, it's a very consistent specification that way. We do have those elements listed on the left-hand side. You'll notice that sequence ID is the second element in our visit general information. This sequence ID is used to help us make sure that we process our records in sequence so that we do always have the correct version of that that is represented. So again, you will see that you need a sequence ID included in your transmission so that we can say which record came first and we process them appropriately. That's the only one that I want to point out from that. Thank you so much. Go ahead. Services and modifiers. So this is just a sample of our appendix 2. So we do have a very lengthy appendix. I wanted to point out kind of some of the elements that are included here. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we have a few characters that represent our payer. So the MOBCBS would be the element that would be put into our payer or payer ID as it's listed within our visit information. Program BCBSHH. You'll notice that HH on the end. That is the identifier that you know you're using a home health program. That identifier, again, is going to be in a couple of different named elements, but payer program, anything like that is going to be taking that particular data. Our HCPCS code is also called our service or our procedure code. So you might see that in a couple of different ways. Again, it's going to be that 5-digit numeric, alphanumeric code that's listed in that column. We do have modifier 1, modifier 2, modifier 3, and modifier 4. So please use the appropriate modifier element to go ahead and communicate the modifier that's indicated as needed. The service description does identify a little bit about the actual service performed, like evaluation of speech fluency. However, it does have association then with perhaps an MCO or with the actual program that was being performed under. So please make sure that as you are looking that through, you're using the appropriate payer and service based on the appropriate MCO or waiver program that you are completing that task through. And then our final column does have task required. You'll notice that for all of our home health visits, there are no tasks that are required. That was in use for our personal care services program. We have one specification that does cover both personal care services and home health care services. So as you look at that, you may see information about personal care services. Please use this as needed for your home health care service transmissions. Go ahead and move to the next one. Visit exceptions. So exceptions are used by the program as a way to make sure that the data aligns. We want to make sure that we have enough information that we satisfy Missouri's EASE program. Most of these exceptions align to cures, which we reviewed with Terry just a few minutes ago. So as we have these exceptions, some of them are actually so important for us to make sure that we have information in the right place and it's correct, that we won't even accept a visit that doesn't have that in there. So as you see on the right, we have unknown client, unknown employee, and missing service. All of those exceptions will never be something that you see in our EASE system, because we will not accept a visit that does not have a client record that's already in our agency account, an employee record that's already in our agency account, and a Missouri correct service. Our visits without any calls, visits without in calls, and visits without out calls are possible to see in our aggregator for our providers. Again, that is an optional child segment. So it is possible that someone could send us a scheduled visit and then turn around and send us their in call and then turn around and send us their out call. And as we are waiting for that out call to be arriving, we might see that we have an exception code 3 where we have an in call exception code 4 where we're missing that out call. Again, the missing task exception is only for our personal care services. And again, there are just some tasks that require that. So if you are a vendor who will be certifying for both programs, just kind of pay attention to the specification. It does lay that all out for you. Again, for all of these, they are what's called fixable. That means that you will not be sending through a visit acknowledgement child segment. You will instead be fixing the data and resubmitting the visit with that visit changes segment to go ahead and have that completed. Let's go ahead and move on. So some common EVV vendor support issues. The first one is our invalid credentials. If you do receive an error message that says request contains the following providers that are not authorized for the given account and credentials, and then it gives you a provider ID, it does mean that we do not have valid credentials to access that provider account agency or agency account. So contact our MO Alt EVV at sandata.com email. That will get you to our tier 3 folks. They will go ahead and help you to make sure that you have the correct credentials. Next slide. Another common issue we have is client not found. There's a couple different ways this comes through. So client not found itself is actually on the visits transmission. However, for the client records, you might see the error message client ID not found. Again, the client that does not exist in that provider account can happen because the client JSON itself failed to be created or created successfully. The transmission of that visit data was not using the correctly formatted client identifier. Perhaps it dropped those leading zeros. That client does not exist in the state provided client member file feed. Again, we would be looking to have that client member feed match based on the identifier, so the DCN that's provided, as well as that date of birth. So if for some reason one of those two are not there or they are not correct to the MMIS data, then we will fail for that reason. And again, you may resubmit in 24 hours if you're fairly confident that you have all the correct information to see if that client identifier might just be processed the next day as part of our daily processing of their file. So check ease to ensure that that client record was successfully added. There is reporting that the provider can do within the aggregator itself to go ahead and make sure that that's there. Obviously, for vendors, that does mean a successful status on that client record. Access the eMomed portal for eligibility and billing to check the member dates of birth. Check that EVV vendor specification for the format, ensure it's got the correct value in the correct field, and then go ahead and reach out to us at moaltevv@sendata.com if you really need some additional help and it looks like everything should be correct. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Worker not found is related to our visit record. So if you get a worker ID not found, that means that employee is not properly specified in our visit data, or that we were unable to process that employee file. So do make sure that you have it correctly formatted, that it matches exactly what that employee identifier was that was sent in the employee record. Let's make sure that we're in the correct field and that that JSON is properly formatted. That can all be checked through that vendor specification. And again, if you still continue to run into problems, moaltevv@sendata.com is your friend. And then retransmit that employee data to ease or that visit data with the corrected employee information. Our next is related to our service ID. So there's error code 553, and we're going to look at two different root causes. Our first root cause causing us to get the error message error during retrieving service ID found is because it's missing a valid Missouri service. Again, we've talked about the fact that we must use a valid Missouri service from our specification with all the applicable modifier fields in the correct combination in order for that to be accepted. So again, I refer you back to those specifications. It would require our engineering team support, so please reach out to moaltevv@sendata.com if you are sending through all that information properly and still having that visit rejected. And then retransmit that corrected visit with any data changes to ease. Next slide. Our other version of this, our other root cause for error during retrieving service ID entered is related to that formatting of the service in the visit. It is case sensitive. We do require the capital letters. So a small t, letter T in the T1019 and small HQ and small HA will be considered invalid. Also, we must have our modifiers in the correct sequence. HQHA as a modifier sequence is considered different than HAHQ, right? So whichever one is valid is what you're going to want to use. Please refer to our specification to make sure that you have that in the correct order. Possible next steps, again, would involve our engineering team. So moaltevv@sendata.com is where you would reach out if you continue to run into issues. And then retransmit with any visit changes to the ease in order to have that visit accepted. So some best practices, we've gone through it multiple times, but I'm going to say it again. Send your client records, make sure they are successfully loaded. Send your employee records, make sure they are successfully loaded. And then finally go through and send those visit records. And let's make sure that we have our clients and employees successfully loaded before we send their visits. Continue to send your visits at a minimum daily. We do require that in alignment with Missouri DSS requirements. And then send your new clients as they are identified or an existing record is updated. Same thing for your employees. Send those new employees as soon as they are identified or an existing record is updated. So working with our customer support. So the following information is really going to be helpful to get an expedited resolution to your case. So please give us your provider name. Even if you are the vendor calling in, please reference the provider. The account number, that ease accounts number, you may see it as an STX number. You may have it in your information as part of your URL that you're sending through. Provider contact name. So we do want to know who it is at the provider that we would contact to follow up with any additional questions. EVV vendor contact information, again, their contact email address and direct phone so that we can make sure that we loop in the vendor if we run into something where there's just a miscommunication. Description of the issue, please provide that brief description of the issue and when it started, right? Sometimes that can be crucial. We can find that we have a resolution that's already out there and simply an older issue just requires a resubmission. Please include any screenshots, JSON files, and definitely your UUIDs. Those are really going to help us to do your investigations. They should be sent securely. But they are required to investigate any errors during the transmission, client not found being one of those, really good ones that we need all that data for. All right, I have gone very long, so I appreciate your patience. I apologize, Lucas, I'm only leaving you 6 minutes, but I am now ready to turn it over to you, so thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. All right, so that was a lot of information to take in over this past hour. Just have a couple more slides to go through before we can start answering some of those questions that you guys have submitted in that Q&A. So for any follow-up information or questions after this meeting, there's a couple of different options that you can use. One of them is you can reach out to SanData with any support issues at the email and phone number that you're seeing on this slide. You can also find the registration link, training information, file specifications, and other information out on the Missouri DSS EVV webpage link that's also on this slide. And we will be sending a copy of this PowerPoint, or we will be posting a copy of this PowerPoint out on that webpage so that you'll be able to access these slides later on. And this last slide has information on the next 2 town hall meetings that we have scheduled. The expectation is that the providers and vendors attend each of these town hall meetings, as each of them will be covering different topics. So please go and register for town halls number 2 and 3 if you haven't had a chance to yet. The follow-up items to be completed before the March 6th town hall will be for providers to register their vendors and complete that aggregator training so that the testing credentials can be delivered for that meeting. After that March 6th meeting, testing will begin and we will meet again for a 3rd town hall on May 17th. That is the soft launch for the system being live and opening up the system to allow you to start submitting your EVV visit data. So again, please complete that registration for those 2 town halls if you haven't yet.
Thank you, Lucas.
Yep, thanks, Deb.
So we may have a few minutes here to look at a few of the Q&A questions. And folks, again, in the interest of time, we probably won't be able to address all of them here, but we will absolutely look to share responses through other channels, whether it be the website, which will probably likely be how we distribute that.
Hey, Deb, this
Yes.
is Terry.
Hey, Terry.
Before you dive into that, I just wanted to talk super briefly, just to follow up with what Lucas just said. He mentioned the system soft launch in May, and I just wanted to talk through that very briefly so that we're all on the same page with that. So what we mean by that is in May, if you as an HHCS provider are sending your data to your EVV vendor and your vendor is up and running and ready to go, we want that visit data to start going as soon as possible on May 17th. If you're not quite ready, if you're still working on it, if there's still testing and tweaking going on, that's okay. Our expectation is that everybody will be sending all of their visit data by the end of October. So that gives you, several more months to work on it. But what we don't want you to do is to say we have until October, so let's not try to meet that May goal. So May really is our goal, but realistically, we know not everybody's going to be ready. So if you're ready, go for it, but come on board as soon as you're ready. Don't drag your feet and don't wait until we get to October, because once we get closer to the end of the year, we're going to start looking at enforcement and start trying to identify those agencies that haven't taken the steps they need to. So just wanted to clarify that. Our goal is May 17th, but you're going to have some flexibility through the end of October. So thank you, Deb, for letting me jump in there.
Has been responding to some of the Q&A directly in that thread. I can't open it at the moment since I'm presenting, but Terry, I don't know if there's any questions in there that you may see readily that you may want to respond to. We'll know we're kind of coming up close on time.
So I see a couple of folks have asked if they're filling out the registration form and their vendor isn't on the list, and what do they need to do? So you would select other and then just type in the agency name that you're utilizing. Make sure we get really good contact information for all of them, but especially if your vendor is not already on the list. A couple of folks have asked if we are requiring schedules to be submitted. At this point, we are only collecting data related to the completed visits. There will be a future enhancement once everybody is getting everything, all our personal care service providers and home health care service providers. Once everybody's on board and we're getting all of our visit data, then we will start talking about the scheduling feature. Right now, no. And then we do have some questions I see about tasks. So when we talk about tasks in relation to EVV, we really were talking about our personal care services. We have some services that actually require you to be very specific about what you're doing, and that's part of the authorization. So an example would be like if you're authorized for a personal care service, it would say you need to give them a bath, wash their hair, very specific. We do require the entry of task at that level. Because home health care services don't operate in that way, we truly don't require you to enter a task. So we're really just looking for what you've done there on the level of the service. So whatever you've done at that high level is adequate for home health. And it looks like we're at time. So there's a lot of questions. And what we'll do is go through the questions and put some answers together. And then we will post those as an FAQ or a similar type document on our website. Give us a minute to do that. There's quite a few questions here for us to answer, but we'll do our best to get answers to you guys pretty quickly.
Terry, I fully agree, but there's one question, if you don't mind me sneaking it in, maybe in the last 30 seconds.
Go for it.
There's a couple of questions about needing to recertify. If you are already certified in the Missouri program as a vendor, you do not need to recertify as part of home health. You will simply need to add the additional services and review that specification. There are no other changes to the specification that we need to highlight here. It is really an addition of those additional payers, programs, service combinations for additional services. So you won't need to go through that recertification again. And yes, the PCS services did go live in 11/11/2021. And again, this is a program increment to include our home health services, and our testing will open on March 6th. So our testing environment will have all of those home health services and able to be testing against that particular group of services at that time. If you are looking to do PCS certification now because you've got a existing provider that needs to have a new vendor, there is no change to the existing process. You can go ahead and start coding and doing those testing for those personal care services. Our home health care services, however, will not be available until March 6th. Okay, thank you so much.
So I'm going to tag on to
everyone.
that just briefly, just super briefly, because you said that if you're an EVV vendor and you've already passed, you don't have to do it again. I just want to make sure everyone understands if you're a personal care service provider and you've already taken all these steps to submit visits for personal care, you do still have to register your vendor and take all those necessary steps for your home health care service agency. So it's kind of different for providers. They do have to go through the process again. Vendors do not.
You're right. You're right. Thanks, Terry, for that distinction. Yes.
Well, thank you, everyone. I know we went a minute or two over. We appreciate your time. This will be posted to the Missouri DSS website. So thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.